All right, let's dive into a truly fascinating slice of history. We're talking about Brazil, specifically the 15 years between 1945 and 1960. Now, this wasn't just any period. This was a time of unbelievable change, a real cultural revolution, where a new, modern Brazil was literally being born. It's where the country forged an identity that, honestly, you can still feel today.
So it all boils down to this one big question. How does an entire nation reinvent itself? I mean, think about it. In 1945, Brazil was just coming out of two massive, earth-shaking events, the end of World War II and the collapse of a long, authoritarian dictatorship called the Estado Novo. The slate was wiped clean and the stage was set for something totally new. And what a whirlwind it was. This timeline gives you a sense of the roller coaster ride. It all kicks off in 45 with democracy returning. Then boom, 1950, television arrives, a total game changer. But then, tragedy strikes in 54 with the suicide of the former dictator Vargas, who had actually returned to power. Just when things look dark, this incredible wave of optimism hits. Brazil wins its very first World Cup in 58, and to top it all off, in 1960, they inaugurate this brand new, futuristic capital city, Brasilia. It was an era of just massive highs and lows.
Now, this cultural explosion, it didn't just happen in a bubble. It was born into a brand new and pretty fragile democracy. And this new Brazil had to figure out who it was in a world that was being torn in two.
You have to remember the global backdrop here. The entire planet was basically split down the middle. On one side, you had the USA pushing capitalism and the American way of life. On the other, the Soviet Union with its vision of communism and the Soviet bloc. It was this giant ideological tug-of-war, and developing nations like Brazil were right in the middle, feeling this immense pressure to pick a side. So what was going on inside Brazil? Well, it was complicated. Yes, you had a return to democracy, which was huge. But among the country's elites, there was this really strong anti-communist fear. At the same time, the shadow of the old populist leader Getulio Vargas was still incredibly long and powerful. Out of this messy, confusing mix came this urgent, growing need for a clear, unified national identity. Okay, so that's the politics. But underneath all of that, a social earthquake was happening. The very fabric of Brazilian life was being rewoven as millions upon millions of people began moving from the quiet countryside into the booming, chaotic cities. And this shift was just profound. You're talking about a move from a traditional community life, where you know your neighbors, your world is based on tradition and direct face-to-face knowledge. And you're moving into this anonymous, fast-paced mass society in a giant city, where what you know about the world is suddenly being shaped by things like radio and movies. It's a whole new way of being.
And we are not talking about a small trickle of people. This was a massive human migration. Millions of people, a lot of them from the poorer Northeast region, packed up and headed for the industrializing cities in the Southeast, places like Rio de Janeiro and São Paulo. They were chasing the promise of jobs and a new life. This didn't just build the cities, it fundamentally reshaped the soul of the entire country.
So you've got this new mass society. How does it talk to itself? How do people in one part of the country connect with people in another? Well, the answer was through the media. The radio and the movie screen became the new voices and visions of this modernizing nation.
If you look at the media landscape back then, one thing is crystal clear. Radio was king, absolutely dominant. Cinema was a big deal, for sure, but a lot of what people saw was from Hollywood. Newspapers were politically powerful, but television? It was brand new, a toy for the rich. In a country where many people couldn't read, radio was the essential tool. It was the internet, the TV, and the social media of its day all rolled into one.
I mean, radio was everything. It's how you got the news through these huge national programs like Reportereso. It's where you discovered the next big music superstar on these live auditorium shows. It's how musical styles from one region, like the Baião of Luis Gonzaga, could suddenly become a national craze. And at night, entire families would be glued to the radio, listening to these dramatic soap operas, the radionovelas. Over in the world of cinema, Brazil cooked up its own incredible, uniquely Brazilian answer to Hollywood, the Chanchada. These movies were amazing. They were these fun musical comedies, often starring the same singers and comics who were huge on the radio. They'd make fun of Hollywood movies, but they also told stories about the humor and the struggles of everyday Brazilian life. They were so much more than just movies. They were a cultural phenomenon.
And this is where it gets really interesting, because the whole cultural battle of the era played out perfectly in the movies. It was like a tale of two studios.
In Rio, you had Atlanta, pumping out these chanchadas that the public absolutely adored, making huge stars out of comedians like Oscarito and Grande Otelo. Then, in São Paulo, you had Veracruz, which tried to be like Hollywood, making these big, prestigious, serious films. They won awards at places like Cannes, but the average person in Brazil, they just weren't interested.
So that whole movie studio rivalry, it was really a perfect symbol of a much bigger split happening in the country. A deep, cultural divide between what the masses loved and what the nation's elites thought was respectable.
And man, this quote from historian Marcos Napolitano, it just hits the nail on the head. He says that for a lot of the political elites, the culture of the common people was basically a source of shame. They looked at the Chanchada films, the popular radio shows, the music, and they saw something unsophisticated, something that held Brazil back from being modern.
You can really break the split down pretty clearly. On one side, you have the elite culture, mostly centered in São Paulo. Their goal was all about international updating, making Brazil look good on the world stage. Think prestigious films and serious European-style theater. On the other side, you had popular culture, centered in Rio. Its goal was simple: mass entertainment. It was all about celebrating national humor and telling stories about daily life.
And look, the São Paulo elite were serious about this. This wasn't just a vague idea. They had a plan. Step 1, establish world-class museums. Step 2, launch a massive international art festival, the Bienal. Step 3, create a sophisticated theater company. And Step 4, build that high-prestige film studio, Veracruz. It was a conscious effort to build a capital of high culture. But then, as we get into the late 1950s, something starts to shift. That huge cultural tension we've been talking about, it begins to resolve itself in this really beautiful way. A new feeling of optimism sweeps the country, and with it comes a new sound that is going to change everything. People often call this time Brazil's golden years, and the man in charge was President Juscelino Kubitschek, or JK as everyone called him. He was known as the Bossa Nova president, and his whole political slogan was 50 years of progress in 5. I mean, talk about ambition. It perfectly captured the confident, forward-looking spirit of the time. And this optimism wasn't just a vague feeling. It was fueled by real, tangible wins. First, you've got the incredible construction of Brasilia, building a whole futuristic capital city from scratch in the middle of nowhere. Then, in 1958, Brazil wins its first ever Soccer World Cup. Can you imagine the national pride? And all of this was happening during a period of major economic growth and development. So this new, optimistic, modern Brazil, it needed a soundtrack, right? And boy, did it get one. It was called Bossa Nova. The name literally means new trend or new way. It was born in the beachside apartments of Rio, and it was this incredible, sophisticated fusion. It took the cool, complex rhythms of samba and blended them with the rich, beautiful harmonies of American jazz. And this revolutionary sound was the brainchild of some absolute geniuses. You had the quiet, brilliant guitar and vocals of João Gilberto, the masterful songwriting of Tom Jobim, and the beautiful, poetic lyrics of Vinicius de Moraes. These are the guys who gave us timeless songs, songs that pretty much everyone in the world still knows, like The Girl from Ipanema. But here's the most important part. Bossa Nova wasn't just great music. It was the answer. It was the cultural synthesis that Brazil had been looking for. Finally, here was something that was popular with the people, but it was also sophisticated and cool enough for the elites. It was uniquely Brazilian, but the whole world thought it was brilliant. For the first time, that deep cultural divide seemed to be bridged. But, and it's a huge but, this incredible, vibrant, optimistic era came to a sudden, grinding halt in 1964 with a military coup. And that leaves us with a really powerful question to think about. What can this story of amazing cultural creation and its sudden end teach us about the incredibly fragile but absolutely essential link between a free, democratic society and its ability to express itself?